this time. Awesome. Thank you, Megan. All right, well, welcome everybody. Looks like we've got a good crowd here. A couple more joining up, so let's go ahead and jump in. Welcome to the USGS Community for Data Integration Tech Stack and CDI Information Technology and Interoperability webinar series. This month, we have Hannah. Is it Ack or Ake?
Ake. Thanks.
Ake. All right.
Yeah.
From the California Water Data Consortium, who is a the California Water Data Consortium is an ESIP partner. Is that the right?
Yeah, as of this year. So
yeah, which is really exciting. And the topic is near and dear to my heart. I know some USGS colleagues that are on here are also very excited to hear what you have. And yeah, I'll let you introduce yourself and take it from there. And I'll start a notes doc and drop it in the chat here in just a moment. And if folks want to jump over there and join me in that, I would much appreciate it. So take it away.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm Hannah Ake. I'm a senior program manager for the California Water Data Consortium, as Dave mentioned. So I'm planning to talk a little bit today about how groundwater well identification currently works in California, and then maybe rant a little bit about the issues caused by our current approach. The great thing is that we have a pretty clear idea of what we need to do to fix it, which we think are persistent, unique well identifiers. But I'd love to have an open discussion with you all at the end of the presentation to hear any suggestions or thoughts you might have on the best way to go about tackling some of the more thorny technical issues associated with this work. So a little background on the consortium, since we are new to ESIP. The consortium is an independent nonprofit organization that was created by a partnership of California state agencies and non-state entities to help ensure that we have the best possible water and ecological information available in the state of California. And so the consortium really believes that this data and its availability is critical to making better decisions at the state level to help those living and working in California in the face of extreme weather events and climate challenges. So excited to be part of ESIP and continue that work. So as part of our work in the state, we work with a lot of different types of projects related to water, but a big portion of the consortium's work lately has been related to groundwater management. So groundwater, as some of you might know, is really critically important in California. Groundwater, it's used for drinking water in homes, it's used to support businesses, as well as farms and ranches, where it's used to irrigate crops and provide water for livestock. So this amounts to collectively about 40 to 60% of California's water supply in a given year. And California alone has over 2 million existing groundwater wells. And many cities, homes, businesses, farms rely actually exclusively on groundwater, which is especially true during dry years when water in reservoirs and lakes and rivers is low. So this really means that as climate variability increases, this increased reliance on groundwater to supplement surface supply is going to get more and more true. So a little bit of context, groundwater in California, groundwater basins in California have the capacity to hold somewhere between 850 million and 1.3 billion acre feet of water. In comparison to that, surface storage in the state from all of our major reservoirs is a little less than 50 million acre feet. So we have a lot of storage capacity in our groundwater basins. And really this climate variability and an increased dependence on groundwater has led to an influx of well drilling in recent decades. And so as many as 15,000 new wells are constructed each year in the state. And really this risk the risk this dependence creates is that when aquifers are overpumped, or also called overdrafted, the groundwater levels are lowered so that no water can be pumped from those wells, which leaves obviously families without clean water to drink, to cook with, to bathe with. But these overpumped aquifers can also create higher concentrations of pollutants in the groundwater, which obviously make it unsafe to drink, but also make it unusable for irrigation in the state. So, despite actually the critical importance of groundwater in California, it was largely unregulated until the passage of what's called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, in 2014, which was passed with the goal of helping to conserve California's groundwater resources and then ultimately to achieve sustainability long term. And so SGMA is pretty unique in the sense that it prioritizes local control of groundwater resources and empowers water agencies, irrigation districts, cities, counties to come together and form what are called groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs. And so the goal here is that they'll be uniquely positioned to kind of work more closely with community-based NGOs, with farmers, with landowners in their area to achieve groundwater basin sustainability within a 20-year time frame. And so these GSAs have been tasked with developing what are called groundwater sustainability plans, or GSPs, to describe their proposed path to sustainability. But obviously managing these basins, developing these plans, this is a pretty monumental undertaking where they need to determine the best ways to monitor their groundwater and then track the associated basin data. So GSAs are going to need to understand their native yield, water quality, how that fluctuates, their pumping patterns seasonally, a lot of different information. So there's really going to be two kind of major data heavy components to achieving this sustainability long term. And the first is going to be groundwater accounting. So many GSAs are working through how to best account for their resources using tools or platforms that they might develop in-house or might use consultants to develop. The consortium is actually working on an open source platform to do this accounting called the Groundwater Accounting Platform, which I'm happy to talk more about if you have any questions or want a demo. But a major portion of this accounting framework and another data heavy component of working towards sustainability is going to be establishing well inventories. And so at a really fundamental level, we need to know where these millions of wells are in California and be able to clearly identify them. And this inventory is going to be super critical for GSAs, as they'll need to know where these wells are, how they're working, so that they are better positioned to kind of understand the extent of any vulnerabilities on those wells, and then ultimately so they can reach their SGMA sustainability goals. So the major problem right now, this is the ranting part, is that a major obstacle to tracking critical well information from a local level to a state level is that currently in California, there is no legislative directive or dedicated funding for a statewide well inventory or an identification program. And so currently there are at least 2 state agencies, at least 1 federal agency, local counties throughout the state all play a role in well management in California, but no one state agency has the authority to manage a well inventory or to require that others use a specific type of identifier to track their wells. And so different agencies at the state and local government level are responsible for managing different facets of a well's life cycle and then regulations associated with it in California. So our Department of Water Resources is responsible for developing and recommending well standards. And this is really critical data collected about wells. DWR, our Department of Water Resources, must then recommend these minimum statewide standards to our State Water Resources Control Board. The state board is the implementing body that publishes those statewide standards in their model well ordinance, or a statewide model well ordinance, and then updates the permitting and inspection requirements for wells. but it's cities, counties, water districts that are then responsible for adopting a local version of that well ordinance for their jurisdiction, which is at least as stringent as that set by the state. But it's actually a separate local enforcing agency, such as a county health department, which is tasked with administering and enforcing this local ordinance through the well permitting process. So wells might be inspected by these local enforcement agencies during or after construction, when they're modified, when they're destroyed, for compliance with that well ordinance, and then must submit their reports to DWR about the inspection. So if you're confused, I don't blame you. This is a lot of information transferred between a lot of different governing bodies. But right now, each of those entities, and even some others I haven't mentioned, have a different way of identifying the same well. But no one entity has the clear authority and or resources to say, this is the unique persistent identifier for this well, and then it's tracked in this database. So I will say, I want to make it really clear that there's obviously a tremendous need to track wells, but it's been done for decades. It's just that because there is no uniform standardized approach to identifying wells, several different efforts have spawned to kind of create this patchwork of well data sets that aren't necessarily aligned or connected to one another in a consistent manner. And so this has caused a few issues. The first I kind of already alluded to, which is that over 5 different identifiers could be used to describe the same well, but there's no clear way to ensure that they're in fact describing the same well without ground truthing, and that can be really expensive or really difficult to do if it's on private property. Lats and lawns are slightly different between each of these databases and can often differ in accuracies. So this isn't always an effective way to match wells either. It's really extremely difficult then to ensure regulatory compliance of individual wells if there is not a consistent way for those regulating entities to communicate about that well. And that this means that it's more difficult to track kind of water quality standards, manage and conserve resources associated with a given well. And then ultimately, if needed, it's going to be really difficult for GSAs to implement any sort of fee structure needed regarding these wells in their basin, should they determine that any of them are out of compliance without a clear well inventory. So a really clear solution to this is to develop a unique persistent identifier for wells, kind of similar to DOIs, and a well inventory in California. A maintained and consistent identifier and a publicly available inventory could help the state and local governments understand the extent of well vulnerabilities, plan for resources for those at risk, be able to more proactively prepare outreach and education to reduce the risks of well outages. The nice thing is that a variety of stakeholders are involved in groundwater management in California really seem to agree that this is the solution, and agree it's especially important given climate variability and requirements under SGMA. The primary obstacle really seems to be the way we go about implementing a program like this at the scale of California. And ultimately, how we generate resources to maintain an inventory at this scale in perpetuity is obviously going to be pretty tricky. So the reality is that this will likely need to be a legislative or regulatory fix. But how do we retain the information that already exists on these millions of wells and retain all the work that's already been done by each of these programs involved in well management in California? Because in many ways, it would be really, really burdensome and costly, even after implementing some sort of standardization, to ask local agencies to scrap their identifiers, to scrap their methodologies that they've been using when they're pretty resource strapped anyway. So how do we do this in an efficient and less costly way that works for the most people? So we're currently thinking about how do we create a program and a system that allows for local groundwater managers to retain the systems that work for them, as SGMA basically stipulates, but creates a consistent methodology to use across programs. And so our current thinking is that we could recommend using some sort of compound ID. And so this would work to allow local agencies or existing programs to retain their existing identification, but it would create a compound unique identifier that would function as a sort of umbrella identifier, with each agency or local governing body being able to retain their internal ID systems. So this compound identifier could function as a unique ID across systems to link all that data and well information. So if there were 3 different IDs for 3 different agencies in California, that compound ID would then become the link between all 3 of those unique IDs. And this compound ID could then become the persistent identifier that's used in a physical well labeling program, and then be included in any statewide well inventory created. We also think it'd be pretty important to make sure that any compound ID is meaningless, and doesn't include meaningful information, because that could perpetuate already existing misunderstandings or inconsistencies over time. So in some ways, we're really thinking that looking forward to new wells coming online, relatively speaking, is going to be the easy part. So if legislation passes, it's going to be fairly straightforward to implement any program for any new wells coming on. The challenging part for us, and that we've been thinking through, is what happens to existing wells and how would we bring those already existing into the fold efficiently. So the great thing is that there are existing well IDs across the nation that we can try and learn from. So as part of our research to pursue what we would need to include in any potential legislative fix in California, we've talked to 4 other states with well ID programs: Oregon, Minnesota, Kansas, and Nevada. But really, I wouldn't be surprised if there are others that we don't know about. So I would love to hear from you all about that. Oregon has implemented a unique well ID system, and began assigning wells to those IDs to those wells in 1996. They require that any newly constructed or modified wells physically attach a well label to the head to promote clear identification. They also use a uniform well ID as the main well identifier, and then store that and collect a variety of historical current well information, including past IDs. So this would kind of function similar to how that compound ID would work. But Oregon is still working through assigning unique well IDs to historical data sets and wells constructed prior to 1996. So this is a common problem that we've seen elsewhere. As in Oregon, Minnesota has implemented a physical well labeling program for their IDs. Nevada assigns unique sequential IDs for wells constructed following the inception of their database. And then Kansas has developed a master well inventory to facilitate linkages between that information on any given well, and then 3 other databases they use in the state. So we're really hoping to continue to learn more from these agencies or other programs out there. But we also know that there's a lot to learn from the private sector and other NGOs. We've learned that the concept of compound IDs is actually really common in the ag industry to track products and their life cycle. And I'm pretty sure this structure is fairly similar to how the Internet of Waters GeoConnects tool works. And I think we've had a chance to talk with them briefly about that. So overall, we know that uniform well IDs and an inventory is achievable. Other states have done it. It's just going to really require effective and persistent collaboration among all the groundwater interests in California. So because this will likely require some sort of legislative fix in California, there's a lot of things we're going to need to iron out along the way, such as authority, funding, system structures. We're going to need to make sure that we're engaging with all these groups impacted by a lack of well ID and a lack of inventory. to really make sure that we're kind of getting this thorough accounting of their needs and concerns, and then ultimately aiming to make any new standards as straightforward to adopt for them as possible. But a big question obviously still remains about the best way to incorporate existing wells into any new system. And so assuming some legislation passes, this retroactive work will likely need to be tied to well inspections. So if a local enforcement agency goes out to inspect a well and there's no tag on it and no uniform identifier tied to it, that well can then be issued an identifier and a tag and brought into the new system. But this is obviously going to be like pretty slow going work, even if things go according to plan, and leaves a lot of opportunity for some of the more vulnerable domestic wells in the state to fall through the cracks for quite some time. So I think it's going to be really critical to identify any technologies, any tools, any programs that have tackled this that might help us to eliminate some of the gaps and then speed up this historical accounting if possible. So I think I'll wrap up there, but I would love to hear if you all have any input or know about any other programs who have tackled similar issues, or any tools you know about that could help us maybe match wells. But thanks so much for having me, and open for any questions you might have.
Cool, thank you so much. I certainly have a few things I could bring up, but I'll open the floor to anybody on the line that wants to ask questions.
Hi, I have a question. This is Pete Rule.
Hey.
If I could figure out how to turn on my camera, I would. Maybe now?
Yeah.
So the one thing that popped into my head, because I work for a federal agency, is are you also dealing with wells on federal land? I mean, I see the local agency identifier. Do all the wells on federal land also get a local agency identifier of one sort or another?
Yeah, Dave, actually, you might know more about this than me, but I'm pretty sure USGS has their own identifying system that they use in California. And so really it's going to be an effort to connect all of these existing programs under one inventory, so that we're not making it harder on ourselves than we need to.
So in a sense, a local agency identifier could just be any agency.
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of local counties essentially have just picked and choose what identifiers they want to use, whether that's from USGS or from a specific state program or their own that they've created. And so that's why it's like a mapping exercise.
Pete's actually the guy at the USGS that runs our monitoring location registry project, so he knows much better than I do. That's all,
yeah, so we should talk more.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about how, well, I'd be curious about how our wells might fit into your scheme.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. And this is all very, it should be obvious, but it's all preliminary, like high level thinking, where it's like we're tackling accounting with GSAs. People need to know where their wells are, but they're struggling to match data sets, and they're struggling in the reporting required from Sigma because they can't identify these wells easily or communicate about these wells easily. So it's kind of like a real recognition that, okay, we've implemented Sigma, GSAs are up and running, but like now we need the inventories to work with this.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm also with USGS. I work under Dave Blodgett on a pretty big undertaking to compile a nationally standardized water well database. So
oh, okay.
reaching out to counterparts at like state agencies and basically asking for their data and then coercing it into like a common data model. And
Yeah.
it's still in the works, and we have a we're kind of incrementally releasing the data.
Okay.
The USGS data hosting platform called ScienceBase.
Okay.
Just generally this topic, like it resonates with me because I have encountered alternate identifiers, other IDs for like the same physical site. I'm sorry, I should reveal myself.
Oh, you're fine.
And so this is really cool work. Maybe you hit on it, but how do you form the composite ID, compound ID? Is that like a simple concatenation, or do you have like a database structure where you've got?
So essentially it would just work as another attribute that you could add to any existing database, but it would be a meaningless ID. So it wouldn't concatenate any information. It would just be a entirely new ID, but then all the existing programs could just include that ID as a new attribute in any database they're managing.
I see. So it's like a mapping of sorts.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, help me understand that. So is somebody going to be minting new IDs?
Yeah, and so that's kind of why we're thinking it needs to be a legislative fix. So it would need to come from the state of California and then track them in a well inventory.
So you mentioned that a particular well may have 5 different IDs
Yeah.
created by different people at different times, but they're all referenced. They're really different IDs for the same well. So we've got a similar idea with, lots of different IDs minted by somebody, which becomes part of the metadata. Where did this ID come from, right? Mm-hmm. But we also have the idea of minting a new ID. So there'd be this, our USGS ID with lots of associated IDs. I'm not sure whether you're thinking about just creating a persistent identifier by, because you said it was a compound ID from SWRCB, DWR identifier, local agency identifier. That sounds like a concatenated.
Yeah, and so
3 IDs concatenated, and you've picked 3 IDs that you're going to use, and
yeah, so that was just an example, but really you could include as many IDs under that umbrella of a unique persistent identifier. Maybe compound ID isn't the correct terminology. We've just heard that from our colleagues in ag who have talked about this structure, but the idea is USGS, DWR, or state board, a local county, another local county, if they all have different IDs to describe that same well, they eventually just get mapped to that unique persistent identifier. And so it could be as many as exists for that well.
So somebody in the state level is going to be creating some unique persistent identifier.
Yeah.
And then all these things are going to be mapped to it.
Yeah. And that's
we have very much the same idea for our database, actually.
Yeah. And that's where the well inventory would come in, which would also be managed at the state level.
Yeah, I had the same initial impression of the word compound.
Yeah, no, that's probably a misnomer.
No, but then your bullet that said, but the IDs won't mean anything. I was like, oh wait, no, that's not what she means. Yeah, this is it's an interesting. So there's been a lot of thought that's gone into this problem. Partly around the distinction between the borehole and the well.
Right. I was going to bring that up.
Yeah, and it just it's endlessly fun. But sticking to water wells, I think stay out of the borehole battle. It's not fun. Because then you also need to link to the samples that came out from the driller as well sometimes, and the driller's logs and the geology. Anyways, This very
Dave,
much.
you're talking up my alley now. I run the USGS's National Index of Borehole Information.
All right.
Sorry, go on.
No, that's great. I was going to say though that this feels like one of the roles that the Internet of Water GeoConnect system is very much trying to fill. And
Totally.
if there is a world that we don't need a state legislated kind of central authority for identifiers, and we could have a more community approach, the GeoConnect system is set up.
Yeah, well, and I don't know, there's a lot of flexibility in the legislation. I think what's the current challenge is that even if staff have the willingness and the capabilities to kind of create and maintain an inventory like this, they don't have the authority, and legal counsel has made it clear that none of these agencies have the authority to say, oh, local counties, you need to map to this identifier, this umbrella identifier. And so there is no real way to create a comprehensive inventory if you can't get people to use that identifier.
Yeah, no, that's the catch for sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting because you have to buy in. You have to buy in from the bottom up.
Yeah.
Whether or not you have a neutral source of IDs.
Well, and then it comes down to the enforcement element too, where it's like who then how do you it's like the trickle down of authority, or it's like you need these local enforcing agencies when they're going out and inspecting wells to say, oh, there's no identifier that's associated. Yeah. I'm going to slap a label on it when I do my inspection.
So just to back up on that kind of thing, in California, is there a law that says if you drill a well, you have to register it with somebody?
Yeah, so that's where the local enforcing agency is kind of is the first boots on the ground. They do the inspection, draft the report, make sure it's in compliance with state board and DWR requirements. But that's where it becomes difficult, is like, who has the authority to eventually then get down to the local enforcing agency to say, we need this information associated with this well. And that would be the obvious opportunity to get the well ID associated with the well. But
so is your hope that these regional groups who are going to try to help the region manage groundwater better going to be that leverage to get the local agencies to? So
the GSAs are responsible for managing basin sustainability, but they work with the local enforcing agencies. They're not an actual enforcing agency themselves. So they have the authority to implement fee structures to ensure that landowners, pumpers in the basin are in compliance with their groundwater sustainability plan, but they have no authority to say, like, go out and put a label on this well. They can't do inspections themselves.
Do you have any scheme for this? So this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm imagining somebody's going to plant a stake in the ground and say, this is the ID. Mm-hmm. And then everybody's going to tie their name to that stake. Do you have any, like, how's that stake going to be generated? Like, is there a technical approach you guys have selected for what you prefer for unique, immutable?
No, we haven't even really gotten that far. We're at the point where there's recognition that because of this authority issue, it will likely need to be a legislative fix. And so kind of backtracking from there, who has the appetite to sponsor this legislation? How do we draft it? What needs to be thought about? Which agencies are named in which roles as having the authority to do what? And so that would all kind of tie back into the technical aspects of thou shalt do this kind of thing.
I just chatted Kyle Wanda that runs the Internet of Water, saying we need some durable URI QR code tags that we can just ship.
you know,
in
like
that.
middle. Yeah.
You install it,
Totally. Yeah.
and
Like,
you
what is
go.
this well? Yeah, totally.
That's actually not that far-fetched.
No, yeah.
But it still has to come with the implied commitment from
Yeah.
the agencies. So
Yeah. Well, and then this obviously, it all ties back to funding. So like, who's paying for all these well labels, who's paying the agencies to maintain a well inventory, because they're going to need to hire staff to do that. So, and how are we paying for it? That sort of thing. I see Ben has his hand up.
yeah, could have been.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment on the scenario where a water well is deepened such that an entirely new aquifer is tapped, or maybe now multiple aquifers are tapped. In the USGS, we don't actually have a firm policy on whether or not that warrants the creation of a new site identifier, but groundwater specialists will tell you that if you have a historical record of data, water levels that are affiliated with that site identifier, and then the well construction is fundamentally or significantly changed such that the historical water levels are no longer kind of comparable, then that might necessitate the creation of a new site altogether.
Yeah, because that I feel like that issue has been a problem where that has happened. The local county, maybe the state, somebody who was doing that addition created a new identifier for that same well. And that has kind of almost perpetuated the problem a little bit, where we have, I guess it's like comes down to defining well and like when you're minting these IDs, which we would need to think through. But it's basically now we have multiple IDs for the same well and multiple IDs through time, maybe from the same program.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I don't know. I mean, you could really conceptualize it either way. I tend to think of it as a monitoring location. Well,
yeah,
other purposes besides monitoring, but
yeah,
yes, I think of it as a monitoring location with different periods of record.
yeah.
But I can see it either way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for water use purposes, it's more of a association to the resource that's
Mm-hmm.
being tapped, right?
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of water use, Nancy Barber was off with a camera on just a little bit. Nancy, did you have a question?
It was actually started out with the compound ID, and Ben and Pete, who I both work with, we covered the compound ID question there. The one thing I wanted to comment on this one is, you know, you do just have to make a decision on how you're handling it, but it's easier from the database side to deal with treating the radically changed well as a new well than to create a database structure that lets you tie to different construction and water level and every other record together and say, it's the one ID, it's the one physical thing out there on the land, but it's got these two completely different histories and construction and all of that. And that's, you know, from your underlying database, that's a little harder to go in and retrofit if you didn't build in that concept. And, you know, the USGS legacy database that Ben's working on modernizing sort of kind of deals with having that kind of history of a well, but not completely, not very well. So that's one of those things to think about if you get into that part of the weeds of when is it a new well, when does it get a new persistent ID, and when doesn't it?
Yeah, oh, that's helpful.
So there's something there about what is the feature being sampled. So in this case, like which aquifer or which depth, instead of the spot on the land surface where there's some equipment.
But then if that changes because you deepen the well.
Yeah, it would. I mean, that's why I'm saying it's about the feature, not the surface of the land. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of weird stuff going on there. The other one is if a well gets destroyed and you have to replace it, and you
Yeah,
replace it 10 feet away, right?
yeah, yeah.
Well, that one to me is clearly a different persistent ID. You know, if you drilled a new hole completely, you're at a different spot on the landscape, even if it's close. So to me, that one's clear. It's the deepened well, you know, that you went down the same borehole and you changed the
Mhm.
hydrologic properties. And you're still at the same thing out there
Right.
on the land.
In the EU, in Inspire, they have separated, at least for monitoring, and this makes sense to me for things like well pumping as well. They've separated the facility question from the well or the sampling question.
Okay.
So you'll have an environmental monitoring facility or
Mhm.
a agricultural pumping facility
Okay.
that is identified distinct from the the thing that's actually in the ground.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And that can be, anyways, there's a little bit of clarity that helps separate the issues of ownership and purpose and relationships to industry or economy kind of things, right? And you can zoom in on what aquifer are we in as a separate set of concerns. So,
Mhm.
but interesting I guess from the borehole more general geology point of view, I guess. Dan, did you have anything?
Now, what we're doing with NIBI is basically a mapping problem for the rest of the metadata, because we've
Okay.
got state contributors to the NIBI database that use different terminology for the various log types, materials, purposes. So we're mapping a standard set, trying to maintain a controlled vocabulary in NIBI that's still,
Mhm.
because we're not actually a repository, we're just an index, and we link back to the original contributors repositories, but still lets them keep their original terms.
Mhm.
But as far as the identifiers, usually they'll use an organization's identifier. Like, I'm not a petroleum person, so I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, well, I don't remember what what it's called, but there's a code for like oil wells that industry uses, and a lot of them have their own IDs that they use for that. And I'm guessing this is, Anna, that your problem is the water analog to the.
Yeah. 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 Do you know how they've done that historical, like retroactive matching?
um yeah, where it's been kind of a major undertaking with getting NIBI off the ground, because
Mhm.
I ran a pilot program for 3 months
Yeah.
with several of the state contributors, and we just went back and forth with vocabularies and said,
Yeah.
what makes sense to put in here?
Yeah.
And what log types do you use? What because I don't want to be too general, but I also
Yeah.
don't want a separate item to have to be selected for every little
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
So it's like, could all of this be classified under oil and gas? Or
Yeah.
could all of this be classified under water resources? Or
Yeah.
do I need agricultural water versus,
Totally.
because
Yeah.
so for NIBI, at the NIBI
Yeah.
level, we basically have a many to one map. It's like if they
Yeah.
have 5 different water related terms on their end, it might just map in NIBI to water resource.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. That's gonna
Yeah,
be
we hadn't gotten to the persistent ID question yet, because I'm dealing with all the different states that are
a meta.
contributing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, we'll let you use whatever you use, because
Yeah.
people will be clicking through from NIBI to get to your site anyway.
Yeah. Totally.
Hey, we're 10 minutes to the top of the hour here. Happy to field more questions if folks have them, or we can call it here. One thing I will share, in case you haven't seen it, Anna, some work that happened early days before we kicked off the GeoConnect system.
Mm-hmm.
The second environmental linked features interoperability experiment. Because there were two interoperability experiments that happened in the Open Geospatial Consortium. So I just put a link
cool.
to one of the use cases for that was this is where multiple data systems hold data about the same well
Yeah.
and need to basically cross-reference with some commonality.
Mm-hmm.
Actually more complicated technically than the problem you have, less complicated from a political bureaucratic point of view.
Yeah.
But from a data system point of view, it's got a lot of similarities. And
Oh, that's great.
Might be worth some review.
Totally. Thanks for sharing.
That's folks from Australia. So.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, and if anyone has any other related problems, programs, things they've been working on, would love to hear about it.
Yeah, no, and I'm sure we'll be crossing paths more as we get this.
Yeah. I know.
I have a lot of stuff off the ground.
Yeah, and I feel like we talked to GeoConnects or Kyle about GeoConnects early on in our exploration of this, but have since realized that the bureaucratic problems are bigger than we realized. So that's why we've been a little bit like pulling back and trying to think from the top down again a little bit.
Yeah, no, that makes good sense. Getting everybody playing by the same set of rules is a challenge.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Dave, with your test, you start with the assumption that you knew which wells were all the same well?
I believe that I'd have to go back and read this use case again.
Like you'd already solved the fact that these are all the same.
They were trying to say, if you have data stored in multiple data centers
Right.
about the same borehole,
Right.
how do you negotiate the fact that they are holding information about the same thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be the question. If you wanted to know all the organizations that hold information about one of these wells and have an ID for one of these wells, how would you negotiate that on the internet?
Yeah.
and the solution to that, there's a whole bunch of technical details that would also feed into what your compound ID scheme might look like. Right?
Yeah.
Anna, do you have a group like trying to figure out the technical part of this, like how this would actually work in the digital realm? Or
Yeah, so this actually spawned out of an effort that I mentioned the groundwater accounting platform that the consortium's working on. So there's a link to that in the chat if you want to poke around. But in talking about that, we were talking about different vocabularies and data types associated with accounting. And then we're kind of going back, and as GSAs we're in the pilot phase of this accounting platform now, but getting ready to roll it out. And a lot of the GSAs are approaching the point where they really need to do this well inventory or develop a well inventory. And so our development team has the architecture for such an inventory, but like we're still at the point where, okay, we have this information, but it can only do so much good if there's not a consistent way to talk about these wells. So
you've built the drawers, but now you got to figure out how to fill them. Is that kind of where you're at?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. And it seems like everyone has kind of more or less been building their own drawers because this was a problem that everybody was facing. But now we're kind of trying to link everything out there. And so, yeah, the accounting platform is really cool. People are really liking it and getting ready to roll it out. But we're kind of at this point where like, okay, we're realizing what gaps are kind of left after Sigma and things like that. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks.
I'll be in touch if you're able to share slides and maybe links to a few things.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
Be happy to get those on the wiki.
Yeah.
And the recording will land on our YouTube if that's cool with you.
Yeah, totally.
Great. Wonderful.
Cool.
Cool. All right. This was great. Thank you so much. Next one, we're going to skip December, and next one is going to be on the GeoComp R and GeoComp Pi work that's happened in the open source geospatial world. So I'll be sending emails out about that and hope to see some folks there. So
Thanks
a lot. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks.